Well, hello everyone, and welcome. It's obviously bedtime, and you're here with me. So today we're going to be reading The Hour of the Dragon by Robert Howard again. It's the Conan story. If you remember, Conan's escape had just been engineered by one of the women of the King Saraglio, and he had rode off through the night and found the horse that had been left for him held by a mercenary, and he fought the mercenary, retrieved his horse, and geared himself in the mercenary's armor with his weapon, traveled back and crossed the border into his kingdom, where he ran into a sorceress who was being threatened by some of the enemy soldiers that were wandering the countryside. Rescued her and then took refuge in her cave while she showed him visions of what was happening in his capital. So, of course, in the morning, he, ignoring her warnings, set off for the capital. And when we left him, I believe he had just encountered one of his loyal followers who at first thought he was a ghost or a spirit come to haunt him and demanded to know, why are you haunting me? What did I do? I've been your loyal follower and supporter. But that's what came before. How is everyone today? Hey Panda, glad you could make it. Random. What lies? I'm alright. I went to bed early and then nearly slept through the stream, to be honest. Somebody came and gave me a boot to the head, told me to wake up and read Conan. So here I am. A little groggy, a little sleepy, but that's alright. Decided trying to pull an all-nighter for the stream was a terrible, terrible plan. Tried that the other day. It didn't go well. Oh, man. So instead, here I am, having slept, trying to wake up. Con has been funny. I don't know if I told you all about it, but the other day, Kana was asleep. Everybody was asleep in the middle of the night, and I get woken up by this big thump, and it was loud enough that it woke the kid up in the other part of the house. She comes running up, bangs on the door, asking if I'm okay, and Kana had in her sleep rolled herself right off the bed, thuds into the floor. Woke herself up that way. Woke everybody up. Poor puppy. But since then, she has been insistent that she must be in the middle of the bed, whether it's occupied or not. Doesn't matter. The middle of the bed is hers because she needs to be as far from the edge so that she does not go flying off of it again. It's very cute. A little annoying. Especially when that means when I lay down, she decides that she must be completely on top of me if I dare to occupy even a portion of the middle of the room. Well, at least it's not the cat thing where she lays on your face random. Cats are throwable. Kana is not throwable. Though she is apparently fallable. But no, it's quite cute. Somewhat annoying, but quite cute. Sorry. One more stretch, apparently. Anybody else notice that each year, when they stretch, a few more things pop and crack than they did the year before? Or is that just me? Maybe it's just me. All right. Anybody have a question for 8 Ball before we switch over? Oh, thanks, Panda. Thanks. By the way, should I put the 8 Ball on the other screens too? Do you guys want to do 8 Ball like during the story, or just are you good with it being like the beginning, end, and intermission? It just have to overlay chat a little bit if I put it in during the story screens. But that's usually not a problem. You guys aren't as talkative when I'm reading. I'm not really getting the feeling that many of you are trolls, so... I'm not terribly worried about that. Just want to focus on the Zen. Alright. Well, before we get started, just a reminder, if you haven't followed, please do click that follow button for me. And, yeah. I don't know, you're a little too random to be a convincing troll. Alright. Well. Let's see, we were reading, about to start chapter 8, Dying Embers. That's not ominous at all, is it? You scared Drea with your cackling? Today it is an orange pico. Sweetened, of course. Her cackling was creepy. All right. Well, no more cackling, at least not for the moment. But, okay, I got you. All right. Well, chapter 8, Dying Embers. The countryside about Tarantia had escaped the fearful ravaging of the more easterly provinces. There were evidences of the march of a conquering army in broken hedges, plundered fields, and looted granaries. But torch and steel had not been loosed wholesale. There was but one grim splotch on the landscape, a charred expanse of ashes and blackened stone, where Conan knew had once stood the stately villa of one of his staunchest supporters. The king dared not openly approach the Galanus farm, which lay only a few miles from the city. In the twilight, he rode through an extensive woodland until he sighted a keeper's lodge through the trees. Dismounting and tying his horse, he approached the thick, arched door with the intention of sending the keeper after Servius. He did not know what enemies the manor house might be sheltering. He had seen no troops, but they might be quartered all over the countryside. But as he drew near, He saw the door open, and a compact figure in silk hose and richly embroidered doublet stride forth and turn up a path that wound away through the woods. "Servius!" At the low call, the master of the plantation wheeled with a startled exclamation. His hand flew to the short hunting sword at his hip, and he recoiled from the tall, gray steel figure standing in the dusk before him. "Who are you?" he demanded. "What is your—" "Mitra!" His breath hissed inward, and his ruddy face paled. "Avaunt!" he ejaculated. "Why have you come back from the gray lands of death to terrify me? I was always your true liegeman in your lifetime." "As I still expect you to be," answered Conan. "Stop trembling, man. I'm flesh and blood." Sweating with uncertainty, Servius approached and stared into the face of the mail-clad giant, and then, convinced of the reality of what he saw, he dropped to one knee and doffed his plumed cap. "Your Majesty, truly this is a miracle passing belief. The great bell in the citadel has told your dirge, days agone. Men said you died at Valkia, crushed under 1,000,000 tons of earth and broken granite." "It was another in my harness," grunted Conan. "But let us talk later, if there is such a thing as a joint of beef on your board." "Forgive me, my lord," cried Servius, springing to his feet. "The dust of travel is gray on your mail, and I keep you standing here without rest or sup. Mitra, I see well enough now that you are alive, but I swear, when I turned and saw you standing all gray and dim in the twilight, the marrow of my knees churned to water. It is an ill thing to meet a man you thought dead in the woodland at dusk." "Bid the keeper see to my steed, which is tied beyond yonder oak," requested Conan, and Servius nodded, drawing the king up the path. The patrician, recovering from his supernatural fright, had become extremely nervous. Love that he's more worried now that he knows it's not a ghost. "I will send a servant from the manor," he said. "The keeper is in his lodge, but I dare not trust even my servants these days. It is better that only I know of your presence." Approaching the great house that glimmered dimly through the trees, he turned aside into a little-used path that ran between close-set oaks, whose intertwining branches formed a vault overhead, shutting out the dim light of the gathering dusk. Servius hurried on through the darkness without speaking, and with something resembling panic in his manner, and presently led Conan through a small side door into a narrow, dimly illuminated corridor. They traversed this in haste and silence, and Servius brought the king into a spacious chamber with a high, oak-beamed ceiling and richly paneled walls. Logs flamed in the wide fireplace, for there was a frosty edge to the air, and a great meat pasty in the stone platter stood smoking on a broad mahogany board. Servius locked the massive door and extinguished the candles that stood in a silver candlestick on the table, leaving the chamber illuminated only by the fire on the hearth. "Your pardon, your majesty," he apologized. "These are perilous times. Spies lurk everywhere. It were better that none be able to peer through the windows and recognize you. This pasty, however, is just from the oven, as I intended supping on my return from talk with my keeper. If your majesty would dine—" "The light is sufficient," grunted Conan, seating himself with scant ceremony and drawing his poniard. He dug ravenously into the luscious dish and washed it down with great gulps of wine from grapes grown in Servius's vineyards. He seemed oblivious to any sense of peril, but Servius shifted uneasily on his settle by the fire, nervously fingering the heavy gold chain about his neck. He glanced continually at the diamond panes of the casement, gleaming dimly in the firelight, and cocked his ear toward the door, as if half expecting to hear the pad of furtive feet in the corridor without. Servius is sus? I don't know. Maybe. I mean, it's not like he could have planned a betrayal of Conan, since he didn't even know the guy was alive. Finishing his meal, Conan rose and seated himself on another settle before the fire. "I won't jeopardize you long by my presence, Servius," he said abruptly. "Dawn will find me far from your plantation." "My lord," Servius lifted his hands in expostulation, but Conan waved his protests aside. "I know your loyalty and your courage. Both are above reproach. But if Valerius has usurped my throne, it would be death for you to shelter me if you were discovered." "I am not strong enough to defy him openly," admitted Servius. "The 50 men-at-arms I could lead to battle would be but a handful of straws. You saw the ruins of Aemilius Scaevonis' plantation?" Conan nodded, frowning darkly. "He was the strongest patrician in this province, as you know. He refused to give his allegiance to Valerius. The Numidians burned him in the ruins of his own villa. After that, the rest of us saw the futility of resistance, especially as the people of Tarantia refused to fight. We submitted, and Valerius spared our lives, though he levied attacks upon us that will ruin many. But what could we do? We thought you were dead. Many of the barons had been slain, others taken prisoner. The army was shattered and scattered. You have no heir to take the crown. There was no one to lead us." "Was there not Count Trocero of Poitan?" demanded Conan harshly. Servius spread his hands helplessly. "It is true that his general Prospero was in the field with a small army. Retreating before Almeric, he urged men to rally to his banner. But with your majesty dead, men remembered old wars and civil brawls, and how Trocero and his Poitanians once rode through these provinces, even as Almeric was riding now, with torch and sword. The barons were jealous of Trocero. Some men, spies of Valerius perhaps, shouted the Count of Poitiers intended seizing the crown for himself. Old sectional hates flared up again. If we had had one man with dynastic blood in his veins, we would have crowned and followed him against Numidia, but we had none." Just because he wasn't able to sabotage earlier, he's not sus. Doesn't mean he's not sus now. Fair enough. Fair enough. Kind of like Meg. Even if Meg hasn't murdered me yet, she's always sus. She even made a point of it when we were playing Among Us the other day. She was the imposter, but she was like, "But I didn't murder any of you, because I love you guys. So don't blame me." So sus. She's my default guess whenever we play Among Us. The barons who followed you loyally would not follow one of their own number, each holding himself as good as his neighbor, each fearing the ambitions of the other. You were the cord that held the faggots together. When the cord was cut, the faggots fell apart. By the way, that's a word for small sticks that you put in a bundle for firewood. Just to be clear. If you had a son, the barons would have rallied loyally to him, but there was no point for their patriotism to focus upon. The merchants and commoners, dreading anarchy and a return of feudal days when each baron was his own law, cried out that any king was better than none, even Valerius, who was at least of the blood of the old dynasty. There was no one to oppose him when he rode up at the head of his steel-clad hosts, with the scarlet dragon of Numidia floating over him, and rang his lance against the gates of Tarantia. Why am I always sus? That's not nice. I'm almost never an imposter, by the way. The merchants and commoners, dreading anarchy, see, now you've got me all thrown off. Nay, the people threw open the gates and knelt in the dust before him. They had refused to aid Prospero in holding the city. They said they had rather be ruled by Valerius than by Trocero. They said, truthfully, that the barons would not rally to Trocero, but that many would accept Valerius. They said that by yielding to Valerius, they would escape the devastation of civil war and the fury of the Numidians. Prospero rode southward with his 10,000 knights, and the horsemen of the Numidians entered the city a few hours later. They did not follow him. They remained to see that Valerius was crowned in Tarantia. Then the old witch's smoke showed the truth, muttered Conan, feeling a queer chill along his spine. Almeric crowned Valerius? Aye, in the coronation hall, with the blood of slaughter scarcely dried on his hands. And do the people thrive under his benevolent rule? Asked Conan with angry irony. He lives like a foreign prince in the midst of a conquered land, answered Servius bitterly. His court is filled with Numidians. The palace troops are of the same breed, and a large garrison of them occupy the citadel. Aye, the hour of the dragon had come at last. Numidians swagger like lords through the street. Women are outraged, and merchants plundered daily, and Valerius either can or will make no attempt to curb them. Nay, he is but their puppet, their figurehead. Men of sense knew he would be, and the people are beginning to find it out. Almeric has ridden forth with a strong army to reduce the outlying provinces, where some of the barons have defied him. But there is no unity among them. Their jealousy of each other is stronger than their fear of Almeric. He will crush them one by one. Many castles and cities, realizing that, have sent in their submission. Those who resist fare miserably. The Numidians are glutting their long hatred, and their ranks are swelled by Aquilonians, whom fear, gold, or necessity of occupation are forcing into their armies. It is a natural consequence. Conan nodded somberly, staring at the red reflections of the firelight on the richly carved oaken panels. Aquilonia has a king instead of the anarchy they feared, said Servius at last. Valerius does not protect his subjects against his allies. Hundreds who could not pay the ransom imposed upon them had been sold to the Gothic slave traders. Conan's head jerked up, and a lethal flame lit his blue eyes. He swore gustily, his mighty hands knotting into iron hammers. Aye, men sell men and women, as it was in the feudal days. In the palaces of Shem and of Turan they will live out the lives of slaves. Valerius is king, but the unity for which the people looked, even though of the sword, is not complete. Gunderland in the north, and Poitain in the south are yet unconquered, and there are unsubdued provinces in the west, where the border barons have the backing of the Bossonian bowmen. Yet these outlying provinces are no real menace to Valerius. They must remain on the defensive, and will be lucky if they are able to keep their independence. Here, Valerius and his foreign knights are supreme. Let him make the best of it, then, said Conan grimly. His time is short. The people will rise when they learn that I'm alive. We'll take Tarantia back before Almeric can return with his army. Then we'll sweep these dogs from the kingdom. Servius was silent. The crackle of the fire was loud in the stillness. Well, exclaimed Conan impatiently, why do you sit with your head bent, staring at the hearth? Do you doubt what I have said? Servius avoided the king's eye. What mortal man can do, you will do, your majesty, he answered. I have ridden behind you in battle, and I know that no mortal being can stand before your sword. What then? Servius drew his fur-trimmed jupon closer about him, and shivered in spite of the flame. Men say your fall was occasioned by sorcery, he said presently. What then? What mortal can fight against sorcery? Who is this veiled man who communes at midnight with Valerius and his allies, as men say, who appears and disappears so mysteriously? Men say in whispers that he is a great magician who died thousands of years ago, but has returned from death's grey lands to overthrow the king of Aquilonia and restore the dynasty of which Valerius is heir. What matter? Exclaimed Conan angrily. I escaped from the devil-haunted pits of Belverus and from diabolism in the mountains. If the people rise... Servius shook his head. Your staunchest supporters in the eastern and central provinces are dead, fled or imprisoned. Gunderland is far to the north, Poitain far to the south. The Pisonians have retired to their marches far to the west. It would take weeks to gather and concentrate these forces, and before that could be done, each levy would be attacked separately by Almeric and destroyed. But an uprising in the central provinces would tip the scales for us, exclaimed Conan. We could seize Tarantia and hold it against Almeric until the Gundermen and Poitanians could get here. Severus hesitated, and his voice sank to a whisper. Men say you died accursed. Men say this veiled stranger cast a spell upon you to slay you and break your army. The great bell has tolled your dirge. Men believe you to be dead, and the central provinces would not rise, even if they knew you lived. They would not dare. Sorcery defeated you at Valkia. Sorcery brought the news to Tarantia, for that very night men were shouting of it in the streets. A Numidian priest loosed black magic again in the streets of Tarantia to slay men who were still loyal to your memory. I myself saw it. Armed men dropped like flies and died in the streets in a manner no man could understand. And the lean priest laughed and said, I am only Altaro, only an acolyte of Orestes, who is but an acolyte of him who wears the veil. Not mine is the power but works through me. Well, said Conan harshly, is it not better to die honorably than to live in infamy? Is death worse than oppression, slavery, and ultimate destruction? When the fear of sorcery is in, reason is out, replied Servius. The fear of the central provinces is too great to allow them to rise for you. The outlying provinces would fight for you, but the same sorcery that smote your army at Valkia would smite you again. The Numidians hold the broadest, richest, and most thickly populated sections of Aquilonia, and they cannot be defeated by the forces which might still be at your command. You would be sacrificing your loyal subjects uselessly. And sorrow I say it, but it is true. King Conan, you are a king without a kingdom. Conan stared into the fire without replying. A smoldering log crashed down among the flames without a bursting shower of sparks. It might have been the crashing ruin of his kingdom. Again, Conan felt the presence of a grim reality behind the veil of material illusion. He sensed again the inexorable drive of a ruthless fate. A feeling of furious panic tugged at his soul, a sense of being trapped, and a red rage that burned to destroy and kill. Where are the officials of my court? He demanded at last. Palantides was sorely wounded at Valkia, was ransomed by his family, and now lies in his castle in Atalis. He will be fortunate if he ever rides again. Publius, the chancellor, has fled the kingdom in disguise. No man knows whither. The council has been disbanded. Some were imprisoned, some banished. Many of your loyal subjects have been put to death. Tonight, for instance, the Countess Albiona dies under the headsman's axe. Conan started and stared at Servius with such anger smoldering in his blue eyes that the patrician shrank back. Why? Because she would not become the mistress of Valerius. Her lands are forfeit, her henchmen sold into slavery, and at midnight, in the Iron Tower, her head must fall. Be advised, my king. To me you will ever be my king, and flee before you are discovered. In these days none is safe. Spies and informers creep among us, betraying the slightest deed or word of discontent as treason and rebellion. If you make yourself known to your subjects, it will only end in your capture and death. I mean, Conan hasn't been gone that long. Like, what, a week maybe? Jeez. His kingdom fell apart really, really quick. My horses and all the men that I can trust are at your disposal. Before dawn, we can be far away from Tarantia, and well on our way toward the border. If I cannot aid you to recover your kingdom, I can at least follow you into exile. Hey, be fair. Although, yes, this is a lady. Earlier, he risked everything to save 7 of his hill chieftains, right? In the previous story. And they were all hairy, unpleasant men. So, he is at least being consistent if he goes to try and save this follower of his. And the witch was not, at least at first, beautiful. She was an old woman. Yeah, he kidnapped her as leverage. And he wanted her to run off and be with him and abandon her supporters. But when it came to a choice of her or his supporters, he chose his people. So he's at least being consistent in his character. Yep. Hairy men, hairy women, all the same to Conan. Conan shook his head. Servius glanced uneasily at him as he sat staring into the fire, his chin propped on his mighty fist. The firelight gleamed redly on his steel mail, on his baleful eyes. They burned in the firelight like the eyes of a wolf. Servius was again aware, as in the past, and now more strongly than ever, of something alien about the king. That great frame under the mail mesh was too hard and supple for a civilized man. The elemental fire of the primitive burned in those smoldering eyes. Now the barbaric suggestion about the king was more pronounced, as if in his extremity the outward aspects of civilization were stripped away to reveal the primordial core. Conan was reverting to his pristine type. He did not act as a civilized man would under the same conditions, nor did his thoughts run in the same channels. He was unpredictable. It was only a stride from the king of Aquilonia to the skin-clad slayer of the Cimmerian hills. "I'll ride to Poitain if it may be," Conan said at last, "but I'll ride alone, and I have one last duty to perform as king of Aquilonia." "What do you mean, your majesty?" asked Servius, shaken by a premonition. "I'm going into Tarantia after Albiona tonight," answered the king. "I have failed all my other loyal subjects, it seems. If they take her head, they can have mine, too." "This is madness," cried Servius, staggering up and clutching his throat, as if he already felt the noose closing about it. "There are secrets to the tower which few know," said Conan. "Anyway, I'd be a dog to leave Albiona to die because of her loyalty to me. I may be a king without a kingdom, but I'm not a man without honor." I mean, to be fair, if he can't actually save her, he's not wrong. "It will ruin us all," whispered Servius. "It will ruin no one but me if I fail. You've risked enough. I ride alone tonight. This is all I want you to do. Procure me a patch for my eye, a staff for my hand, and garments such as travelers wear." So he's pulling a Robin Hood, going to dress as a beggar to infiltrate before the execution/marriage of the maid Albiona instead of the maid Marion. Chapter 9. It is the king, or his ghost. Many men passed through the great arched gates of Tarantia between sunset and midnight. Belated travelers, merchants from afar with heavily laden mules, free workmen from the surrounding farms and vineyards. Now that Valerius was supreme in the central provinces, there was no rigid scrutiny of the folk who flowed in a steady stream through the wide gates. Discipline had been relaxed. The Numidian soldiers who stood on guard were half drunk and much too busy watching for handsome peasant girls and rich merchants who could be bullied to notice workmen or dusty travelers. Even one tall wayfarer whose worn cloak could not conceal the hard lines of his powerful frame. Robin Hood's very much the older story. This man carried himself with an erect, aggressive bearing that was too natural for him to realize it himself, much less dissemble it. A great patch covered one eye, and his leather coif, drawn low over his brows, shadowed his features. With a long, thick staff in his muscular brown hand, he strode leisurely through the arch, where the torches flared and guttered, and, ignored by the tipsy guardsmen, emerged upon the wide streets of Tarantia. Okay, I can see that, although Conan's wearing more like beggar's gear than a wedding dress. Fair enough, though. Imagine the wedding dress was a bit shredded as well. Are you sure this was a Marvel-approved comic? Upon these well-lighted thoroughfares, the usual throngs went about their business, and shops and stalls stood open, with their wares displayed. One thread ran a constant theme through the pattern. Numidian soldiers, singly or in clumps, swaggered through the throngs, shouldering their way with studied arrogance. Women scurried from their path, and men stepped aside with darkened brows and clenched fists. The Aquilonians were a proud race, and these were their hereditary enemies. The knuckles of the tall traveler knotted on his staff, but, like the others, he stepped aside to let the men in armor have the way. Among the motley and varied crowd, he did not attract much attention in his drab, dusty garments. But once, as he passed a sword seller's stall, and the light that streamed from its wide door fell full upon him, he thought he felt an intense stare upon him, and turning quickly, saw a man in the brown jerkin of a free workman regarding him fixedly. This man turned away with undue haste, and vanished in the shifting throng. But Conan turned into a narrow by-street and quickened his pace. It might have been mere idle curiosity, but he could take no chances. The grim iron tower stood apart from the citadel, amid a maze of narrow streets and crowding houses, where the meaner structures, appropriating a space from which the more fastidious shrank, had invaded a portion of the city ordinarily alien to them. The tower was in reality a castle, an ancient, formidable pile of heavy stone and black iron, which itself served as the citadel in an earlier, ruder century. Not a long distance from it, lost in a tangle of partly deserted tenements and warehouses, stood an ancient watchtower, so old and forgotten that it did not appear on the maps of the city for 100 years back. Its original purpose had been forgotten, and nobody, of such as saw it at all, noticed that the apparently ancient lock which kept it from being appropriated as sleeping quarters by beggars and thieves was in reality comparatively new and extremely powerful, cunningly disguised into an appearance of rusty antiquity. Not half a dozen men in the kingdom had ever known the secret of that tower. No keyhole showed in the massive green-crusted lock, but Conan's practiced fingers, stealing over it, pressed here and there knobs invisible to the casual eye. The door silently opened inward, and he entered solid blackness, pushing the door shut behind him. A light would have showed the tower empty, a bare cylindrical shaft of massive stone. Groping in a corner with the sureness of familiarity, he found the projections for which he was feeling on a slab of the stone that composed the floor. Quickly, he lifted it, and without hesitation lowered himself into the aperture beneath. His feet felt stone steps leading downward into what he knew was a narrow tunnel that ran straight toward the foundations of the iron tower, 3 streets away. The bell on the citadel, which tolled only at the midnight hour, or for the death of a king, boomed suddenly. In a dimly lighted chamber in the iron tower, a door opened, and a form emerged into a corridor. The interior of the tower was as forbidding as its external appearance. Its massive stone walls were rough, unadorned. The flags of the floor were worn deep by generations of faltering feet, and the vault of the ceiling was gloomy in the dim light of torches set in niches. The man who trudged down that grim corridor was in appearance in keeping with the surroundings. He was a tall, powerfully built man, clad in close-fitting black silk. Over his head was drawn a black hood, which fell about his shoulders, having 2 holes for his eyes. From his shoulders hung a loose black cloak, and over one shoulder he bore a heavy axe, the shape of which was that of neither tool nor a weapon. As he went down the corridor, a figure came hobbling up it, a bent, surly old man, stooping under the weight of his pike and a lantern he bore in one hand. "You are not as prompt as your predecessor, Master Headsman," he grumbled. "Midnight has just struck, and masked men have gone to Milady's cell. They await you." "The tones of the bell still echo among the towers," answered the executioner. "If I am not so quick to leap and run at the beck of Aquilonians as was the dog who held this office before me, they shall find my arm no less ready. Get you to your duties, old watchman, and leave me to mine. I think mine is the sweeter trade by Mitra, for you tramp cold corridors and peer at rusty dungeon doors, while I lop off the fairest head in Tarantia this night." A YouTube vid of Thor in a wedding dress. All right. Oh, there you go, guys. If you're watching this and you want to see Thor in cosplay, click that Discord link and join the Discord. I bet Vela will even use the chat command to link it up in the chat. And you can see Thor in cosplay. The watchman limped on down the corridor. "Thank you, Vela." "Oh, okay. He's legit the bride. Fair enough." The watchman limped on down the corridor, still grumbling, and the headsman resumed his leisurely way. A few strides carried him around a turn in the corridor, and he absently noted that at his left a door stood partly open. If he had thought, he would have known that the door had been open since the watchman passed. But thinking that was not his trade, he was passing the unlocked door before he realized that aught was amiss, and then it was too late. A soft, tigerish step, and the rustle of a cloak warned him, but before he could turn, a heavy arm hooked about his throat from behind, crushing the cry before it could reach his lips. In the brief instant that was allowed him, he realized with a surge of panic the strength of his attacker, against which his own brawny thews were helpless. He sensed without seeing the poised dagger. "Numidian dog," muttered a voice thick with passion in his ear. "You've cut off your last Aquilonian head." Nope, even if I find the sight of him in a dress a little shocking, I wouldn't stop him. Wouldn't want to keep you guys from getting a charge out of it either. And that was the last thing he ever heard. Dork? Why am I a dork? I'm not a dork. Not much. I mean, if we made our follower goal this month, I might tell the story of the last time I did wear a dress. No comment for that? I think you're stretching a bit for more than once. Well, I suppose technically more than once, though all wrapped together in the same, story. But you guys will have to help me find, 23 more followers before the end of the month? Otherwise, no story for you. And no fake accounts either. No cheatings. In a dank dungeon, lighted only by a guttering torch, 3 men stood about a young woman who knelt on the rush-strewn flags, staring wildly up at them. She was clad only in a scanty shift. Her golden hair fell in lustrous ripples about her white shoulders, and her wrists were bound behind her. Even in the uncertain torchlight, and in spite of her disheveled condition and pallor of fear, her beauty was striking. She knelt mutely, staring with wide eyes up at her tormentors. The men were closely masked and cloaked. Such a deed as this needed masks, even in a conquered land. She knew them all, nevertheless, but what she knew would harm no one after that night. Shame on you, Random. Our merciful sovereign offers you one more chance, Countess, said the tallest of the 3, and he spoke Aquilonian without an accent. He bids me say that if you soften your proud, rebellious spirit, he will still open his arms to you. If not, he gestured toward a grim wooden block in the center of the cell. It was blackly stained, and showed how many deep nicks, as if a keen edge, cutting through some yielding substance, had sunk into the wood. Albiona shuddered and turned pale, shrinking back. Every fiber... Okay, this is a sentence. Every fiber in her vigorous young body quivered with the urge of life. Valerius was young too, and handsome. Many women loved him, she told herself, fighting with herself for life. But she could not speak the word that would ransom her soft young body from the block and the dripping axe. She could not reason the matter. She only knew that when she thought of the clasp of Valerius's arms, her flesh crawled with an abhorrence greater than the fear of death. She shook her head helplessly, compelled by an impulsion more irresistible than the instinct to live. She is not breasted boobily yet. Hello, little dude. Great timing to jump in there. Then there is no more to be said, exclaimed one of the others impatiently, and he spoke with a Numidian accent. Where is the headsman? As if summoned by the word, the dungeon door opened silently, and a great figure stood framed in it, like a black shadow from the underworld. Albiona voiced a low, involuntary cry at the sight of that grim shape, and the others stared silently for a moment, perhaps themselves daunted with superstitious awe at the silent, hooded figure. Through the coif, the eyes blazed like coals of blue fire, and as these eyes rested on each man in turn, he felt a curious chill travel down his spine. Then the tall Aquilonian roughly seized the girl and dragged her to the block. She screamed uncontrollably and fought hopelessly against him, frantic with terror, but he ruthlessly forced her to her knees and bent her yellow head down to the bloody block. What was he doing sleeping instead of listening to story time anyway? Shame on him. Why do you delay, headsman? He exclaimed angrily. Perform your task. He was answered by a short, gusty boom of laughter that was indescribably menacing. All in the dungeon froze in their places, staring at the hooded shape. The 2 cloaked figures, the masked man bending over the girl, and the girl herself on her knees, twisting her imprisoned head to look upward. What means this unseemly mirth, dog? Demanded the Aquilonian uneasily. The man in the black garb tore his hood from his head and flung it to the ground. He set his back to the closed door and lifted the headsman's axe. "Do you know me, dogs?" he rumbled. "Do you know me?" The breathless silence was broken by a scream. "The king!" shrieked Albiona, wrenching herself free from the slackened grasp of her captor. "Oh, Mitra, the king!" The three men stood like statues, and then the Aquilonian started and spoke, like a man who doubts his own senses. Fair enough. Sorry, I tried to inhale tea instead of drinking it. Didn't figure you wanted to hear me cough into the mic. Not that sort of channel. Yeah, breathing tea is not very effective. "Conan," he ejaculated. "It is the king, or his ghost. What devil's work is this?" "Devil's work to match devils," mocked Conan, his lips laughing, but hell flaming in his eyes. "Come, fall to, my gentlemen. You have your swords, and I this cleaver. Nay, I think this butcher's tool fits the work at hand, my fair lords." "At him," muttered the Aquilonian, drawing his sword. "It is Conan, and we must kill or be killed." And like men waking from a trance, the Numidians drew their blades and rushed on the king. The headsman's axe was not made for such work, but the king wielded the heavy, clumsy weapon as lightly as a hatchet, and his quickness of foot, as he constantly shifted his position, defeated their purpose of engaging him, all three at once. He caught the sword of the first man on his axe head and crushed in the wielder's breast with a murderous counterstroke before he could step back or parry. The remaining Numidian, missing a savage swipe, had his brains dashed out before he could recover his balance, and an instant later the Aquilonian was backed into a corner, desperately parrying the crashing strokes that rained about him, lacking opportunity even to scream for help. The exultations of my lungs. Okay. Suddenly, Conan's long left arm shot out and ripped the mask from the man's head, disclosing the pallid features. "Dog," grated the king, "I thought I knew you. Traitor, damned renegade. Even this base steel is too honorable for your foul head. Nay, die as thieves die." The axe fell in a devastating arch, and the Aquilonian cried out and went to his knees, grasping the severed stump of his right arm from which blood spouted. It had been shorn away at the elbow. And the axe, unchecked in its descent, had gashed deeply into his side, so that his entrails bulged out. "Lie there and bleed to death," grunted Conan, casting the axe away disgustedly. "Come, Countess." Stooping, he slashed the cords that bound her wrists, and lifting her as if she had been a child, strode from the dungeon. She was sobbing hysterically, with her arms thrown about his corded neck in a frenzied embrace. "Easy all," he muttered. "We're not out of this yet. If we can reach the dungeon where the secret door opens on stairs that lead to the tunnel. Devil take it, they've heard that noise, even through these walls." Down the corridor, arms clanged, and the tramp and shouting of men echoed under the vaulted roof. A bent figure came hobbling swiftly along, lantern held high, and its light shone full on Conan and the girl. With a curse, the Cimmerian sprang toward him, but the old watchman, abandoning both lantern and pike, scuttled away down the corridor, screeching for help at the top of his cracked voice. Deeper shouts answered him. Conan turned swiftly and ran the other way. "Shame on you, Random. There's a little dude in here." He was cut off from the dungeon with the secret lock and the hidden door through which he had entered the tower, and by which he had hoped to leave, but he knew this grim building well. Before he was king, he had been imprisoned in it. He turned off into a side passage and quickly emerged into another, broader corridor, which ran parallel to the one down which he had come, and which was at the moment deserted. He followed this only a few yards, when he again turned back down another side passage. This brought him back into the corridor he had left, but at a strategic point. A few feet farther up the corridor, there was a heavy bolted door, and before it stood a bearded Numidian in corselet and helmet, his back to Conan as he peered up the corridor in the direction of the growing tumult and wildly waving lanterns. Conan did not hesitate. Slipping the girl to the ground, he ran at the guard swiftly and silently, sword in hand. The man turned just as the king reached him, bawled in surprise and fright, and lifted his pike. But before he could bring the clumsy weapon into play, Conan brought down his sword on the fellow's helmet with a force that would have felled an ox. Helmet and skull gave way together, and the guard crumpled to the floor. Now, if there are narrow corridors in like a prison, why in the world is he wielding a pike? I mean, does that make sense to anybody? I would expect more like a truncheon or something. Or a short sword. In an instant, Conan had drawn the massive bolt that barred the door, too heavy for one ordinary man to have manipulated, and called hastily to Albiona, who ran staggering to him. Catching her up unceremoniously with one arm, he bore her through the door and into the outer darkness. They had come into a narrow alley, black as pitch, walled by the side of the tower on one hand, and the sheer stone back of a row of buildings on the other. Conan, hurrying through the darkness as swiftly as he dared, felt the latter wall for doors or windows, but found none. Yeah, but I mean, that's such a small percentage of it. Also, if you're going to disable prisoners that are trying to break away, you don't really want to stab them, right? Because you got more of a chance of hitting important organs. The great door clanged open behind them, and men poured out, with torches gleaming on breastplates and naked swords. They glared about, bellowing, unable to penetrate the darkness which their torches served to illuminate for only a few feet in any direction, and then rushed down the alley at random, heading in the direction opposite to that taken by Conan and Albiona. They'll learn their mistake quick enough, he muttered, increasing his pace. If we ever find a crack in this infernal wall... Damn! The street watch! Ahead of them a faint glow became apparent, where the alley opened into a narrow street, and he saw dim figures looming against it with a glimmer of steel. It was indeed the street watch, investigating the noise they had heard echoing down the alley. Who goes there? They shouted, and Conan grit his teeth at the hated Numidian accent. Keep behind me, he ordered the girl. We've got to cut our way through before the prison guards come back and pin us between them. And grasping his sword, he ran straight at the oncoming figures. The advantage of surprise was his. He could see them, limned against the distant glow, and they could not see him coming at them out of the black depths of the alley. He was among them before they knew it, smiting with the silent fury of a wounded lion. His one chance lay in hacking through before they could gather their wits. But there were a score of them, in full mail, hard-bitten veterans of the border wars, in whom the instinct for battle could take the place of bemused wits. 3 of them were down before they realized that it was only one man who was attacking them. But even so, their reaction was instantaneous. The clangor of steel rose deafeningly, and sparks flew as Conan's sword crashed on bassinet and hauberk. He could see better than they, and in the dim light his swiftly moving figure was an uncertain mark. Flailing swords cut empty air or glanced from his blade, and when he struck, it was with the fury and certainty of a hurricane. But behind him sounded the shouts of the prison guards, returning up the alley at a run, and still the mailed figures before him barred his way with a bristling wall of steel. In an instant, the guards would be on his back. In desperation, he redoubled his strokes, flailing like a smith on an anvil, and then was suddenly aware of a diversion. Out of nowhere behind the watchman rose a score of black figures, and there was a sound of blows murderously driven. Steel glinted in the gloom, and men cried out, struck mortally from behind. In an instant, the alley was littered with writhing forms. A dark, cloaked shape sprang toward Conan, who heaved up his sword, catching a gleam of steel in the right hand. But the other was extended to him empty, and a voice hissed urgently, "This way, your majesty, quickly!" With a muttered oath of surprise, Conan caught up Albiona in one massive arm, and following his unknown befriender. He was not inclined to hesitate, with 30 prison guardsmen closing in behind him. Surrounded by mysterious figures, he hurried down the alley, carrying the Countess as if she had been a child. He could tell nothing of his rescuers, except that they wore dark cloaks and hoods. Doubt and suspicion crossed his mind, but at least they had struck down his enemies, and he saw no better course than to follow them. As if sensing his doubt, the leader touched his arm lightly and said, "Fear not, King Conan. We are your loyal subjects." The accent was not familiar, or the voice was not familiar, but the accent was Aquilonian of the central provinces. Behind them, the guards were yelling as they stumbled over the shambles in the mud, and they came pelting vengefully down the alley, seeing the vague dark mass moving between them and the light of the distant street. But the hooded men turned suddenly toward the seemingly blank wall, and Conan saw a door agape there. He muttered a curse. He had traversed that alley by day in times past, and had never noticed a door there. But through it they went, and the door closed behind them with the click of a lock. The sound was not reassuring, but his guides were hurrying him on, moving with the precision of familiarity, guiding Conan with a hand at either elbow. It was like traversing a tunnel, and Conan felt Albiona's lithe limbs trembling in his arms. All the trembles. Though, in this case, I'd say they're warranted. Then, somewhere ahead of them, an opening was faintly visible, merely a somewhat less black arch in the blackness, and through this they filed. After that, there was a bewildering succession of dim courts and shadowy alleys and winding corridors, all traversed in utter silence, until at last they emerged into a broad, lighted chamber, the location of which Conan could not even guess, for the devious route had confused even his primitive sense of direction. And all right, we will take a break here for just a little bit. And I will refill my tea. Well, I will partially refill my tea, as the pot is now empty. So what do you think? Has Conan fallen in with the Thieves' Guild now? I have not looked at any messages in Discord while I was reading, but I will. Oh. Been a lot of messages since then. Hey, don't be like that. I'm looking, I'm looking. Be nice to me. Tell you, 8-Ball doesn't love me, that's for sure. Okay, let's be fair. I am like 20 pages of messages back and in a whole other month and I still haven't gotten it. Okay, if it's this many messages back, you cannot be mad at me. All right, well, I can't find it, so I'm sorry. But okay. All right, I'm looking. I mean, I'm kind of a traditionalist with the tea. I really like the whole like boiling the water and you brew it in a ceramic teapot. So I'm really just looking for something to keep either the ceramic teapot warm or the mug. I mean, traditionally you'd use a small brazier with a tea light, but I don't really trust myself around fire and computing gear. Not at the same time, anyway. Definitely not a hipster. That is that is not an accusation that can be leveled against me. You can accuse me of a great many other things, but not that. I have looked, I just haven't purchased yet. But I have looked, I promise. And you accuse me of being me? Okay. That's fair. Alright. Well, 8-Ball likes you. Also, I don't have any grapes. I need grapes. I should get grapes. All right. Well, shall we go back to the story? I'm going to reprogram you, 8-Ball. I'm going to give you all kinds of other responses. What? What? Betrayal, 8-Ball. You and me, we're going to have words after this stream. All right. Let's go back to the story. That way I can get some refuge from all the picking ons. Getting picked on by everybody. Even the widget is picking on me. Ugh. Did you just tell me to shut up and read, Bish? See how it is. Cracking the whip on me, you people. All right. Chapter 10. A coin from Acheron. Not all his guides entered the chamber. When the door closed, Conan saw only one man standing before him. A slim figure, masked in a black cloak with a hood. This the man threw back, disclosing a pale oval of a face with calm, delicately chiseled features. The king set Albiona on her feet, but she still clung to him and stared apprehensively about her. The chamber was a large one, with marble walls partly covered with black velvet hangings and thick, rich carpets on the mosaic floor, laved in the soft golden glow of bronze lamps. Conan instinctively laid a hand on his hilt. There was blood on his hand, blood clotted about the mouth of his scabbard, for he had sheathed his blade without cleansing it. "Where are we?" he demanded. The stranger answered with a low, profound bow, in which the suspicious king could detect no trace of irony. "In the temple of Asura, your majesty." Albiona cried out faintly and clung closer to Conan, staring fearfully at the black arched doors, as if expecting the entry of some grisly shape of darkness. "Fear not, my lady," said their guide. "There is nothing here to harm you, vulgar superstition to the contrary. If your monarch was sufficiently convinced of the innocence of our religion to protect us from the persecution of the ignorant, then certainly one of his subjects need have no apprehensions." "Who are you?" demanded Conan. "I am Hadrathus, priest of Asura. One of my followers recognized you when you entered the city and brought word to me." Conan grunted profanely. "Do not fear that others discovered your identity," Hadrathus assured him. "Your disguise would have deceived any but a follower of Asura, whose cult it is to seek below the aspect of illusion. You were followed to the watchtower, and some of my people went into the tunnel to aid you if you returned by that route. Others, myself among them, surrounded the tower." "And now, King Conan, it is yours to command. Here in the temple of Asura, you are still king." "Why should you risk your lives for me?" asked the king. "You were our friend when you sat upon the throne," answered Hadrathus. "You protected us when the priests of Mitra sought to scourge us out of the land." Conan looked about him curiously. He had never before visited the temple of Asura, had not certainly known that there was such a temple in Tarantia. The priests of the religion had a habit of hiding their temples in a remarkable fashion. The worship of Mitra was overwhelmingly predominant in the Hyborian nations, but the cult of Asura persisted, in spite of official ban and popular antagonism. Conan had been told dark tales of hidden temples, where intense smoke drifted up incessantly from black altars, where kidnapped humans were sacrificed before a great coiled serpent, whose fearsome head swayed forever in the haunted shadows. Persecution caused the followers of Asura to hide their temples with cunning art and to veil their rituals in obscurity. And this secrecy, in turn, evoked more monstrous suspicions and tales of evil. But Conan's was the broad tolerance of the barbarian, and he had refused to persecute the followers of Asura, or to allow the people to do so on no better evidence than what was presented against them, rumors and accusations that could not be proven. If they are black magicians, he had said, how will they suffer you to harry them? If they are not, there is no evil in them. Crom's devils, let men worship what gods they will. Bye, little dude. You going back to school? Thanks for hanging out with us for a little bit. At a respectful invitation from Hadrathus, he seated himself on an ivory chair and motioned Albiona to another, but she preferred to sit on a golden stool at his feet, pressing close against his thigh, as if seeking security in the contact. Like most orthodox followers of Mitra, she had an intuitive horror of the followers and cult of Asura, instilled in her infancy and childhood by wild tales of human sacrifice and anthropomorphic gods shambling through shadowy temples. Hadrathus stood before them, his uncovered head bowed. What is your wish, your majesty? Food first, he grunted, and the priest smote a golden gong with a silver wand. Scarcely had the mellow notes ceased echoing when 4 hooded figures came through a curtained doorway, bearing a great 4-legged silver platter of smoking dishes and crystal vessels. This they set before Conan, bowing low, and the king wiped his hands on the damask and smacked his lips with unconcealed relish. Beware, your majesty, whispered Albiona. These folk eat human flesh. I'll stake my kingdom that this is nothing but honest roast beef, answered Conan. Come, lass, fall to. You must be hungry after the prison fare. Thus advised, and with the example before her of one whose word was the ultimate law to her, the countess complied, and ate ravenously, though daintily, while her liege lord tore into the meat joints and guzzled the wine with as much gusto as if he had not already eaten once that night. You priests are shrewd, Hadrathus, he said, with a great beef bone in his hands, and his mouth full of meat. I'd welcome your service in my campaign to regain my kingdom. Slowly, Hadrathus shook his head, and Conan slammed the beef bone down on the table in a gust of impatient wrath. Crom's devils! What ails the men of Aquilonia? First Servius, now you? Can you do nothing but wag your idiotic heads when I speak of ousting these dogs? Hadrathus sighed and answered slowly. My lord, it is ill to say, and I fain would say otherwise, but the freedom of Aquilonia is at an end. Nay, the freedom of the whole world may be at an end. Age follows age in the history of the world, and now we enter an age of horror and slavery, as it was long ago. What do you mean? Demanded the king uneasily. Hadrathus dropped into a chair and rested his elbows on his thighs, staring at the floor. It is not alone the rebellious lords of Aquilonia and the armies of Numidia which are arrayed against you, answered Hadrathus. It is sorcery, grisly black magic from the grim youth of the world. An awful shape has risen out of the shades of the past, and none can stand before it. What do you mean? Conan repeated. I speak of Zaltatun of Acheron, who died 3,000 years ago, yet walks the earth today. Conan was silent, while in his mind floated an image, the image of a bearded face of calm, inhuman beauty. Again he was haunted by a sense of uneasy familiarity. Acheron. The sound of the word roused instinctive vibrations of memory and associations in his mind. Acheron, he repeated. Zaltatun of Acheron. Man, are you mad? Acheron has been a myth for more centuries than I can remember. I've often wondered if it ever existed at all. It was a black reality, answered Hadrathus, an empire of black magicians, steeped in evil now long forgotten. It was finally overthrown by the Hyborian tribes of the west. The wizards of Acheron practiced foul necromancy, thaumaturgy of the most evil kind, grisly magic taught them by devils. And of all the sorcerers of that accursed kingdom, none was so great as Zaltatun of Python. Then how was he ever overthrown? Asked Conan skeptically. By some means, a source of cosmic power, which he jealously guarded, was stolen and turned against him. That source has been returned to him, and he is invincible. Albiona, hugging the headsman's black cloak about her, stared from the priest to the king, not understanding the conversation. Conan shook his head angrily. You are making game of me, he growled. If Zaltatun has been dead 3,000 years, how can this man be he? It is some rogue who's taken the old one's name. Hadrathus leaned to an ivory table and opened a small gold chest which stood there. From it he took something which glinted dully in the mellow light, a broad gold coin of antique minting. You have seen Zaltatun unveiled? Then look upon this. It is a coin which was stamped in ancient Acheron before its fall. So pervaded with sorcery was that black empire, that even this coin has its uses in making magic. Conan took it and scowled down at it. There was no mistaking its great antiquity. Conan had handled many coins in the years of his plunderings, and had a good practical knowledge of them. The edges were worn and the inscription almost obliterated, but the countenance stamped on one side was still clear-cut and distinct, and Conan's breath sucked in between his clenched teeth. It was not cool in the chamber, but he felt a prickling of his scalp, an icy contraction of his flesh. The countenance was that of a bearded man, inscrutable, with a calm, inhuman beauty. I mean, he could have sent away for a great bushy black beard from a prop company and then, tried to blame it on one of the brothers. No Agatha Christie references. By Crom, it's he, muttered Conan. He understood now the sense of familiarity that the sight of the bearded man had roused in him from the first. He had seen a coin like this once before, long ago, in a far land. The tea's gone to my head? No. With a shake of his shoulders, he growled, The likeness is only a coincidence, or if he's shrewd enough to assume a forgotten wizard's name, he's shrewd enough to assume his likeness. But he spoke without conviction. The sight of that coin had shaken the foundations of his universe. He felt that reality and stability were crumbling into an abyss of illusion and sorcery. A wizard was understandable, but this was diabolism beyond sanity. We cannot doubt that it is indeed Zaltatun of Python, said Hadrathus. He it was who shook down the cliffs at Valkia, by his spells that enthrall the elementals of the earth. He it was who sent the creatures of darkness into your tent before dawn. Conan scowled at him. How did you know that? The followers of Asura have secret channels of knowledge. That does not matter. But do you realize the futility of sacrificing your subjects in a vain attempt to regain your crown? Conan rested his chin on his fist and stared grimly into nothing. Albiona watched him anxiously, her mind groping bewildered in the mazes of the problem that confronted him. Is there no wizard in the world who could make magic to fight Zaltatun's magic? He asked at last. Hadrathus shook his head. If there were, we of Asura would know of him. Men say our cult is a survival of the ancient Stygian serpent worship. That is a lie. Our ancestors came from Bindaya, beyond the Sea of Viliet and the blue Himalayan mountains. We are sons of the East, not the South, and we have knowledge of all the wizards of the East, who are greater than the wizards of the West, and not one of them would be but a straw in the wind before the black might of Zaltatun. But he was conquered once, persisted Conan. Aye, a cosmic source was turned against him, but now that source is again in his hands, and he will see that it is not stolen again. And what is this damnable source? Demanded Conan irritably. It is called the Heart of Ahriman. When Acheron was overthrown, the primitive priest who had stolen it and turned it against Zaltatun hid it in a haunted cavern and built a small temple over the cavern. Thrice thereafter the temple was rebuilt, each time greater and more elaborately than before, but always on the site of the original shrine, though men forgot the reason therefore. Memory of the hidden symbol faded from the minds of common men and was preserved only in priestly books and esoteric volumes. Whence it came no one knows. Some say it is the veritable heart of a god. Others that it is a star that fell from the skies long ago. Until it was stolen, none had looked on upon it for 3,000 years. When the magic of the Mitran priests failed against the magic of Zaltatun's acolyte, Altaro, they remembered the ancient legend of the heart, and the high priest and an acolyte went down into the dark and terrible crypt below the temple, into which no priest had descended for 3,000 years. In the ancient iron-bound volumes which speak of the heart in their cryptic symbolism, it is also told of a creature of darkness left by the ancient priest to guard it. Far down, in a square chamber with arched doorways leading off into immeasurable blackness, the priest and his acolytes found a black stone altar that glowed dimly with inexplicable radiance. On that altar lay a curious gold vessel, like a double-valved seashell which clung to the stone like a barnacle. But it gaped open and empty. The heart of Ahriman was gone. While they stared in horror, the keeper of the crypt, the creature of darkness, came upon them, and mangled the high priest so that he died. But the acolyte fought off the being, a mindless, soulless waif of the pits brought long ago to guard the heart, and escaped up the long black narrow stairs, carrying the dying priest, who, before he died, gasped out the news to his followers, bade them to submit to a power they could not overcome, and commanded secrecy. But the word has been whispered about among the priests, and we of Asura learned of it. And Zaltatun draws his power from this symbol? Asked Conan, still skeptical. No, his power is drawn from the Black Gulf. But the heart of Ahriman came from some far universe of flaming light, and against it the powers of darkness cannot stand, when it is in the hands of an adept. It is like a sword that might smite at him, not a sword with which he can smite. It restores life and can destroy life. He has stolen it, not to use it against his enemies, but to keep them from using it against him. A shell-shaped bowl of gold on a black altar in a deep cavern, Conan muttered, frowning as he sought to capture the elusive image. That reminds me of something I have heard or seen. But what, in Crom's name, is this notable heart? It is in the form of a great jewel, like a ruby, but pulsing with blinding fire, with which no ruby ever burned. It glows like living flame. But Conan sprang suddenly up and smote his right fist into his left palm like a thunderclap. Crom, he roared, what a fool I've been! The heart of Ahriman, the heart of my kingdom! Find the heart of my kingdom, Zalata said. By Ymir, it was the jewel I saw in the green smoke, the jewel which Tarascus stole from Zaltatun while he lay in the sleep of the Black Lotus. Adrastus was also on his feet. His calm dropped from him like a garment. What are you saying? The heart stolen from Zaltatun? Aye, Conan boomed. Tarascus feared Zaltatun and wanted to cripple his power, which he thought resided in the heart. Maybe he thought the wizard would die if the heart was lost. By Crom! Ah! With a savage grimace of disappointment and disgust, he dropped his clenched hand to his side. I forgot. Tarascus gave it to a thief to throw into the sea. By this time the fellow must be almost to Cordava. Before I can follow him, he'll take ship and consign the heart to the bottom of the sea. The sea will not hold it, exclaimed Hadrathus, quivering with excitement. Zaltatun would himself have cast it into the ocean long ago, had he not known that the first storm would carry it ashore. But on what unknown beach might it not land? Well, Conan was recovering some of his resilient confidence. There's no assurance that the thief will throw it away. If I know thieves, and I should, for I was a thief in Zamora in my early youth, he won't throw it away. He'll sell it to some rich trader. By Crom, he strode back and forth in his growing excitement. It is worth looking for. Zalata bade me find the heart of my kingdom, and all else she showed me proved to be truth. Can it be that the power to conquer Zaltatun lurks in that crimson bauble? Aye, my head upon it, cried Hadrathus. His face lightened with fervor, his eyes blazing, his fists clenched. With it in our hands, we can dare the powers of Zaltatun. I swear it. If we can recover it, we have an even chance of recovering your crown and driving the invaders from our portals. It is not the swords of Numidia that Aquilonia fears, but the black arts of Zaltatun. Conan looked at him for a space, impressed by the priest's fire. It's like a quest and a nightmare, he said at last. Yet your words echo the thought of Zalata, and all else she said was truth. I'll seek for this jewel. It holds the destiny of Aquilonia, said Hadrathus with conviction. I will send men with you. Nay, exclaimed the king impatiently, not caring to be hampered by priests on his quest, however skilled in esoteric arts. This is a task for a fighting man. I go alone. First to Poitain, where I'll leave Albiona with Trocero, then to Cordava, and to the sea beyond if necessary. It may be that, even if the thief intends carrying out Tarascus' order, he'll have some difficulty finding an outbound ship at this time of the year. And if you find the heart, cried Hadrathus, I will prepare the way for your conquest. Before you return to Aquilonia, I will spread the word through secret channels that you live and are returning with a magic stronger than Zaltatun's. I will have men ready to rise on your return. They will rise if they have assurance that they will be protected from the black arts of Zaltatun. And I will aid you on your journey. He rose and struck a gong. A secret tunnel leads from beneath this temple to a place outside the city wall. You shall go to Poitain on a pilgrim's boat. None will dare molest you. As you will. With a definite purpose in mind, Conan was afire with impatience and dynamic energy. Only let it be done swiftly. In the meantime, events were moving not slowly elsewhere in the city. A breathless messenger had burst into the palace, where Valerius was amusing himself with his dancing girls, and throwing himself on his knee, gasped out a garbled story of a bloody prison break and the escape of a lovely captive. He bore also the news that Count Thespius, to whom the execution of Albiona's sentence had been entrusted, was dying, and begged for a word with Valerius before he passed. Hurriedly cloaking himself, Valerius accompanied the man through various winding ways, and came to a chamber where Thespius lay. There was no doubt that the Count was dying. Bloody froth bubbled from his lips at each shuddering gasp. His severed arm had been bound to stop the flow of blood, but even without that, the gash in his side was mortal. Alone in the chamber with the dying man, Valerius swore softly. By Mitra, I had believed that only one man ever lived who could strike such a blow. Valerius, gasped the dying man. He lives! Conan lives! What are you saying? Ejaculated the other. I swear by Mitra, gurgled Thespius, gagging on the blood that gushed to his lips. It was he who carried off Albiona. He is not dead. No phantom came back from hell to haunt us. He is flesh and blood, and more terrible than ever. The alley behind the tower is full of dead men. Beware, Valerius. He has come back to slay us all. A strong shudder shook the blood-smeared figure, and Count Thespius went limp. Valerius frowned down at the dead man, cast a swift glance about the empty chamber, and stepping swiftly to the door, cast it open suddenly. The messenger and a group of Numidian guardsmen stood several paces down the corridor. Valerius muttered something that might have indicated satisfaction. Have all the gates been closed? He demanded. Yes, your majesty. Triple the guards at each. Let no one enter or leave the city without strictest investigation. Set men scouring the streets and searching the quarters. A very valuable prisoner has escaped with the aid of an Aquilonian rebel. Did any of you recognize the man? No, your majesty. The old watchman had a glimpse of him, but it could only say that he was a giant, clad in the black garb of the executioner, whose naked body we found in an empty cell. He is a dangerous man, said Valerius. Take no chances with him. You all know the Countess Albiona. Search for her, and if you find her, kill her and her companion instantly. Do not try to take them alive. Returning to his palace chamber, Valerius summoned before him 4 men of curious and alien aspect. They were tall, gaunt, of yellowish skin and in immobile countenances. They were very similar in appearance, clad alike in long black robes, beneath which their sandaled feet were just visible. Their features were shadowed by their hoods. They stood before Valerius with their hands in their wide sleeves, their arms folded. Valerius looked at them without pleasure. In his far journeyings he had encountered many strange races. When I found you starving in the Khitan jungles, he said abruptly, exiles from your kingdom, you swore to serve me. You have served me well enough in your abominable way. One more service I require, and then I set you free from your oath. Conan the Cimmerian, king of Aquilonia, still lives, in spite of Zaltatune's sorcery. Or perhaps because of it, I know not. The dark mind of that resurrected devil is too devious and subtle for a mortal man to fathom. But while Conan lives, I am not safe. The people accepted me as the lesser of 2 evils, when they thought he was dead. Let him reappear, and the throne will be rocking under my feet in revolution before I can lift my hand. Perhaps my allies mean to use him to replace me if they decide I have served my purpose. I do not know. I do know that this planet is too small for 2 kings of Aquilonia. Seek the Cimmerian. Use your uncanny talents to ferret him out wherever he hides or runs. He has many friends in Tarantia. He had aid when he carried off Albiona. It took more than one man, even such a man as Conan, to wreak all that slaughter in the alley outside the tower. But no more. Take your staffs and strike his trail. Where that trail will lead you I know not, but find him, and when you do, slay him. The 4 Khitans bowed together, and still unspeaking, turned and padded noiselessly from the chamber. All right. Shall we try to finish one more chapter? What do you guys think? I'm up for it. I was afraid I'd put you all to sleep. I mean, I know it's obviously bedtime, but I didn't want you to fall asleep just yet. I was hoping to read a little bit more to you. Kindle insists that I can read it in 19 minutes. So, should be able to make it. All right. Chapter 11. Swords of the South. Dawn that rose over the distant hills shone on the sails of a small craft that dropped down the river, which curves to within a mile of the walls of Tarantia, and loops southward like a great shining serpent. Right, but Kindle adapts to my reading speed, so it is measuring based on how fast I've been reading this book. This boat differed from the ordinary craft plying the broad Korotas, fishermen and merchant barges loaded with rich goods. It was long and slender, with a high curving prow, and was black as ebony, with white skulls painted along the gunwales. Amidships rose a small cabin, and the windows closely masked. Other craft gave the ominously painted boat a wide berth, for it was obviously one of those pilgrim boats that carried a lifeless follower of Asura on his last mysterious pilgrimage southward, to where far beyond the Poitanian mountains a river flowed at last into the blue ocean. In that cabin undoubtedly lay the corpse of the departed worshipper. All men were familiar with the sight of those gloomy craft, and the most fanatical votary of Mitra would not dare touch or interfere with their somber voyages. Where the ultimate destination lay, men did not know. Some said Stygia, some a nameless island lying beyond the horizon. Others said it was in the glamorous and mysterious land of Vindia, where the dead came home at last. But none knew certainly. They only knew that when a follower of Asura died, the corpse went southward down the great river, in a black boat rowed by a giant slave, and neither boat nor corpse nor slave was ever seen again, unless indeed certain dark tales were true, and it was always the same slave who rowed the boats southward. The man who propelled this particular boat was as huge and brown as the others, though closer scrutiny might have revealed the fact that the hue was the result of carefully applied pigments. He was clad in leather loincloth and sandals, and he handled the long sweep and oars with unusual skill and power. But none approached the grim boat closely, for it was well known that the followers of Asura were accursed, and that these pilgrim boats were loaded with dark magic. So men swung their boats wide and muttered an incantation as the dark craft slid past, and they never dreamed that they were thus assisting in the flight of their king and the Countess Albiona. It was a strange journey in that black, slim craft, down the great river for nearly 200 miles to where the Koritos swings eastward, skirting the Poitanian mountains. Like a dream, the ever-changing panorama glided past. During the day, Albiona lay patiently in the little cabin, as quietly as the corpse she pretended to be. Only late at night, after the pleasure boats with their fair occupants lounging on silken cushions and the flare of torches held by slaves had left the river, before dawn brought the hurrying fisher boats, did the girl venture out. Then she held the long sweep, cunningly bound in place by ropes to aid her, while Conan snatched a few hours of sleep. But the king needed little rest. The fire of his desire drove him relentlessly, and his powerful frame was equal to the grinding test. Without halt or pause they drove southward. So down the river they fled, through nights when the flowing current mirrored the million stars, and through days of golden sunlight, leaving winter behind them as they sped southward. They passed cities in the night, above which throbbed and pulsed the reflection of the myriad lights, lordly river villas and fertile groves. So at last the blue mountains of Poitain rose above them, tier above tier, like ramparts of the gods, and the great river, swerving from those turreted cliffs, swept thunderously through the marching hills with many a rapid and foaming cataract. Conan scanned the shoreline closely, and finally swung the long sweep and headed inshore at a point where a neck of land jutted into the water, and fir trees grew in a curiously symmetrical ring about a gray, strangely shaped rock. "How these boats ride those falls we hear roaring ahead is more than I can see," he grunted. "Adrastus said they did, but here's where we halt. He said a man would be waiting for us with horses, but I don't see anyone. How word of our company could have preceded us, I don't know anyway." He drove inshore and bound the prow to an arching root in the low bank, and then, plunging into the water, washed the brown paint from his skin and emerged dripping and in his natural color. From the cabin he brought forth a suit of Aquilonian ringmail which Adrastus had procured for him, and his sword. These he donned while Albiona put on garments suitable for mountain travel. And when Conan was fully armed and turned to look toward the shore, he started, and his hand went to his sword. For on the shore, under the trees, stood a black-cloaked figure holding the reins of a white palfrey and a bay warhorse. "Who are you?" demanded the king. The other bowed low. "A follower of Asura. A command came. I obeyed." "How came?" inquired Conan, but the other merely bowed again. "I have come to guide you through the mountains, to the first Poitanian stronghold." "I don't need a guide," answered Conan. "I know these hills well. I thank you for the horses, but the Countess and I will attract less attention alone than if we were accompanied by an acolyte of Asura." The man bowed profoundly, and giving the reins into Conan's hands, stepped into the boat. Casting off, he floated down the swift current toward the distant roar of the unseen rapids. With a baffled shake of his head, Conan lifted the Countess into the palfrey's saddle, and then mounted the horse and reined toward the summits that castellated the sky. The rolling country at the foot of the towering mountains was now a borderland, in a state of turmoil, where the barons reverted to feudal practices, and bands of outlaws roamed unhindered. Poitain had not formally declared her separation from Aquilonia, but she was now, to all intents, a self-contained kingdom, ruled by her hereditary count Trocero. The rolling south country had submitted nominally to Valerius, but he had not attempted to force the passes guarded by strongholds where the crimson leopard banner of Poitain waved defiantly. The king and his fair companion rode up the long blue slopes in the soft evening. As they mounted higher, the rolling country spread out like a vast purple mantle far beneath them. Shot with the shine of rivers and lakes, the yellow glint of broad fields, and the white gleam of distant towers. Ahead of them and far above, they glimpsed the first of the Poitanian holds, a strong fortress dominating a narrow pass, the crimson banner streaming against the clear blue sky. Before they reached it, a band of knights in burnished armor rode from among the trees, and their leader sternly ordered the travelers to halt. They were tall men, with the dark eyes and raven locks of the south. "Halt, sir, and state your business and why you ride toward Poitain." "Is Poitain in revolt, then?" asked Conan, watching the other closely, that a man in Aquilonian harness is halted and questioned like a foreigner. "Many rogues ride out of Aquilonia these days," answered the other coldly. "As for revolt, if you mean the repudiation of a usurper, then Poitain is in revolt. We would rather serve the memory of a dead man than the scepter of a living dog." Conan swept off his helmet, and shaking back his black mane, stared full at the speaker. The Poitanian stared violently and went livid. "Saints of heaven," he gasped. "It is the king! Alive!" The others stared wildly. Then a roar of wonder and joy burst from them. They swarmed about Conan, shouting their war cries and brandishing their swords in their extreme emotion. The acclaim of Poitanian warriors was a thing to terrify a timid man. "Oh, but Trocero will weep tears of joy to see you, sire," cried one. "Aye, and Prospero," shouted another. "The general has been like one wrapped in a mantle of melancholy, and curses himself night and day that he did not reach the Valkia in time to die beside his king." "Now we will strike for Empery," yelled another, whirling his great sword about his head. "Hail Conan, king of Poitain!" The clangor of bright steel about him and the thunder of their acclaim frightened the birds that rose in gay-hued clouds from the surrounding trees. The hot southern blood was the... Ow, 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 Jesus, ow, fuck, ow. Sorry, hang on, be right back. Ow. Okay. That really hurts. So, somebody brought me a fresh mug of tea, and the I picked it up, and the tea bag got caught on something and pulled out and fell on my arm on the pullover I was wearing. And since it was boiling hot and soaked in boiling hot tea, it started scalding my arm, and I got the tea bag off, but it soaked through the pullover, so there was still boiling hot tea like pressed against my arm. And so I just went and ran it under cold water. But I have a scalded patch on my arm that's like 3 centimeters by 2 centimeters, a big oval. It really hurts. It hurts a lot. So, yeah, bright red patch on my arm where it's scalded. Hasn't started blistering yet, so that's good. But, yeah, that hurts a lot. I hope you guys don't mind, but I think I'm going to stop there and go put some ice on it. Yeah. So, well, a mimic is never a bad assumption. But yeah, we'll pick this up next week, and we'll read Agatha Christie tomorrow. Thank you guys for coming, but I'm gonna go put ice on my arm because yeah, now it's really starting to burn. But thank you everybody for coming, and yeah, if you catch the recording, don't forget to hit follow, and make sure you go over to the YouTube and hit subscribe. But I will catch you guys later. All right. Have a good night or day, wherever you are.